Hello, everybody. My name is Griffin Gassert. I'm the global lead for cyber threat intelligence at EY, formerly known as Ernst& Young. My team provides early warning and indication for the firm's 300,000 plus endpoints in 150 plus countries. I'm a former intelligence officer for the U.S. Department of Defense, where I got to do some pretty fun things in some not so fun regions. But I also developed an understanding and appreciation for intelligence and counter intel. Now I take those principles and I do my best to scale them to the private world. I don't share my background to demonstrate bona fides because you heard it. There aren't any. I used to work in a discipline that viewed technology as a huge threat to operations, so we often just avoided it. But armed with my always relevant history degree and limited exposure to information technology, uh, even I was able to figure out how to design and execute an effective threat model. And that's really my intent for this talk. I want you to walk away with the building blocks of how you or somebody in your program can get comfortable enough that you can start using threat models. I know if you perform a search for a threat model through one of the many popular search engines, you'll get some highly complex explanations of how to make sure that your application isn't exploited by the 12-year-old that took a break from Fortnite to ruin your day. This isn't that kind of explanation. Remember when I said I have a history degree? So let's make sure we manage expectations from the history major. And to also be clear, all opinions are my own. They are not representative of EY.
Before we dig into threat modeling, it's important that we establish the context and an understanding of where threat modeling fits into your defensive security posture. There are varying interpretations of where threat modeling belongs in a SOC. It's kind of like if organization A said, they said, we'll tell you that the moon landing was absolutely real. Organization B says, no, that moon landing was fake. It was performed on a Hollywood set. And then organization C comes in and says, well, I'm not interested in the moon. Let me know when they land on the sun. There's always going to be varying levels of interpretation and understanding and what people care about. For me, in purpose of this presentation, threat modeling fits in with the threat intelligence function in a security organization. And like I said, that's going to vary based on your organization, but the important thing is that it aligns with one of your proactive teams, because that's what it really is at its core. It's taking a known threat vector and preparing to defend against it in anticipation of it potentially affecting your organization. So for a lot of organizations, CTI, the group responsible for providing early warning and indication for the security teams, performs threat modeling. And to level set, when I refer to cyber threat intelligence or CTI, it's with the mission of getting in front of a threat and developing proactive solutions before the organization experiences the threat. You can, of course, have a user or an asset compromised. Then you can conduct an investigation, and you can perform analysis on artifacts after the fact, along the lines of lessons learned. But if you're only developing your security posture solely based on after the fact behaviors, you're missing out on a great opportunity to make your organization a hard target. And this proactive approach may involve implementing new technology or tuning some of the tools you have, or more commonly, developing behavioral logic to alert in your SIM, or maybe on an endpoint monitoring tool. It's something to alert your analysts to the threat. Now, this concept is important because it's crucial in threat modeling to have a purpose. This isn't just a routine effort that ends in an informational report. It's great if you develop an informational report that may educate some of your analysts, but if it isn't actionable, it's just academic and not really providing the value we all want to provide. So keep this in mind, because what your end goal is for this is really going to shape how you approach the problem set. Threat modeling is a structured, repeatable process we use to assess the likelihood an attacker will experience success against your organization through a particular threat. And it isn't something that you're going to be able to apply to every single threat occurring in the wild. It should be reserved for threats that are novel in nature or have the potential to circumvent your security controls. There's a lot of pressure from the C-suite and your leaders to know everything about the threat landscape and how it'll affect your organization. But it's unrealistic to think that you as an analyst will be able to know if your existing detections or tools will catch the newest Sodinokibi strain, or if your tools will detect DNS tunneling just by reading the latest published article from a vendor or reading a brief description of how an exploit works for a new critical vulnerability. But if the threat is rated high enough in your own rating scheme, it'll be worth running it through a threat model to see if your tools catch it or see if your existing rules will alert your SOC analysts. And this is the second factor of threat modeling that should garner just as much attention. It's an opportunity to identify gaps in your coverage or your tools and either improve those tools or fill the gaps with some organic behavioral detections. Or maybe you need to implement some new technology if the threat is critical enough. Now, you won't necessarily achieve all of these every single time you execute a threat model, but ideally you at least develop detections or identify areas for improvement. Just below here, there are some basic steps you need to follow to ensure that you're spending your time and resources effectively. And perhaps this is a little simplified, but that's how I prefer to do things. There are a number of different approaches out there like PASTA or the Microsoft model, but those aren't universally applicable to every organization. We're not all built like Microsoft. We don't have those resources. That's just the reality of it. You'll have to figure out what works best for you. But if you follow these basic steps in whatever form or fashion, you'll be set up for success. And we'll get into these a bit deeper in a few minutes. But the real takeaway here is that there is a process you can follow and adapt to make your own to match with your group's maturity level. But there's a few things beyond a process that you'll need to execute a threat model. And we'll discuss each step in a follow-on slide. So let's figure out the basic components you really need to execute a threat model. Now, the simple answer to what you need for a threat model is literally a threat, a system, and an analyst. If you have those three things, you can threat model. What you need and what you have available are going to vary greatly. But it doesn't mean you can't execute. It just means you have to adapt a little bit. And of course, there are some situations where you'll be at a loss. For example, last year sometime there were reports of attackers abusing the link local multicast name resolution and NetBIOS name service. They're doing it to perform person in the middle type attacks and steal NTLM hashes. Kind of a complicated threat, but really relevant to pretty much everybody. But if you want to run a threat model to assess your posture against this, and you're minimally resourced, but your CISO said, I want to know how this affects us, you better figure out how to make it work. You already have all three of the necessary components. You have a threat, LLMNR abuse to capture NTLM hashes. You have a system, your corporate machine, and you are an analyst, I assume. If you aren't the analyst, then you have one working for you. So you still have an analyst. In the most basic sense, you can take a look at that process and understand that the normal execution of a successful process to identify potential points of exploitation, like a bad DNS resolution because of a typo, or the asset has since been deactivated, or maybe an attacker provides a bad link. When you look into the process, maybe you also see that the web proxy auto discovery is disabled and your scripts are actually custom, so there's a high likelihood you're protected. Or maybe they aren't, and you know you're susceptible to this type of attack, and you skip right to the oh no portion of the threat model, where you start to figure out the worst case scenario if an attacker does successfully capture those hashes. Because it isn't just about seeing how the attack happens, but figuring out the what if aspect of it. What if there's a successful compromise? Where else can they move in the network? What else can they abuse with those hashes? In this case, when you have minimal resources and you're figuring it out academically versus practically, there's still a lot of value, even if you aren't seeing the actual traffic and commands. But let's say the academic conclusion isn't sufficient. We need to find a way to prevent this if we don't have the ability to create custom scripts and turn WPAT off. If you want to model the threat, you can simply set up packet capture to see what your machine does with a typo to a resource. And you can make some basic analytical assessments based on that observed traffic. But with some additional resources, you can take it a step further. Starts to get into that complicated answer. And you can get a second system set up on the network to pose as the attacker and set up a malicious virtual server to see exactly what that traffic flow looks like and where an attacker may be able to move after they've gained access to the identified asset. Making this effort easier would be a comprehensive asset list that I'm sure your organization has, because every organization has one. Not really. Assuming your org doesn't have the most comprehensive asset list, asset discovery is going to be part of the complicated answer too. To get back on track, you can check with some of your other teams, see if they'll allow you to use a dev server for a few hours if you promise not to break anything. But whether you spin up a VM or borrow a dev server, you just have to be resourceful. Now, if you want to really emulate the threat, you'll spin up an attacker email address, send yourself or a fellow analyst a malicious document to gain that initial access. You'll set up a malicious virtual server, have your susceptible fellow analyst try to reach an unreachable resource, capture that traffic, and then you'll then have to start to hypothesize what your attacker might be able to do with those hashes, like I mentioned before. And that second option, where you run the entire attack chain, is ideal because you may potentially discover other gaps in your coverage or other areas for additional protection. But the basic approach of understanding the network connections and execution of the process will occur in both scenarios. It's just in the second, you have more opportunity. But that gets back to what I said originally. You can threat model regardless of available resources. Your end result may vary a bit, that's all. So don't think just because you have limited resources, you can't have this function. You just need to make sure you're executing the essentials. All that is a long-winded way of saying that you can execute a threat model regardless of how well resourced you are. And as you mature, you'll be able to build in intelligence requirements that determine which threats are critical to your organization. You'll be able to identify assets during the planning stage. You'll know which teams to bring into the discussion if you need another team to assist. You also know which tools are available to you, and you'll have a documented process and additional analysts to scale your efforts. So while both of these answers are possible, you have to figure out which one's best for you at this point in your team's maturity. The other question is, when do you conduct a threat model? What's the right time? And that's probably one of the most common questions. And the answer is kind of whenever you want. But remember when I just said the complicated answer includes intel requirements and determining when a threat is critical? That should be step one. You need to ask yourself, does this threat even matter to me and my organization? That should always be your first question. And this does come down to a question of your group's purpose, what resources are available, and how mature and capable your team is. But the thing to remember is threat modeling isn't for every single threat you see or you think may affect you. If you magically have those resources, good for you. Almost nobody does. Threat modeling should be reserved for those threats that you really do not understand and your analysts have assessed has a high likelihood of occurring against your organization. Now, if you're a private financial institution in South America and there's a notable attack by a state-sponsored entity against the diplomatic mission of 5 Southwest Asian nations, do you really think that you're at risk of being targeted with that attack vector? Do you need to conduct a threat model? Probably not. Almost certainly not. But if you're a medical provider working on COVID-19 vaccine and a nation state is reportedly compromising academic institutions that are publicly reporting their work on vaccines, and they're doing so with a relatively novel attack vector, that's one worth taking note of and seeing if you're protected, or where you can improve your detections. In my opinion, the top two reasons to conduct a threat model are: one, a persistent TTP is experiencing success against your organization, and your current rules and alerts just aren't helping. Or two, there's a new critical vulnerability disclosed along with a proof of concept. That's always going to be one of interest. But for persistent TTP, the only way to protect the organization is to take another look, conduct some basic analysis, and provide some fresh input on how best to defeat the TTP. In the case of a new vulnerability disclosure, that of course comes with minimal information, because that's just how it usually goes. The best approach is to ensure that you are faster than the threat actor. Over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen a lot of critical vulnerabilities disclosed and POCs released within hours following that disclosure. We're seeing the delay between disclosure and exploit decrease significantly. And for enterprise environments, patching is a notable challenge, especially when you have to ensure your resources are available for clients, or that you aren't just breaking something and disrupting operations. Because there's so much effort behind making sure a patch is effective without breaking things, the process can be slow. And I mean, slow, but this is understandable. However, threat actors know this, and they don't need to be smarter than us, just faster. So one way to support the patching process is for the CTI team to run one of those POCs in the environment and analyze that activity so we can develop some of our own detections to alert on this, at least until the enterprise is fully patched. And worst case scenario, you have extra detection in place. This is, again, something that has to be considered against your intel requirements and reserved for those CVEs that are easily exploitable and can cause serious damage to an organization. Think net logon, or the last Internet Explorer vulnerabilities, or even F5 Big IP. They were all trivial, and they had POCs following disclosure within hours. Patches were coming, but if a team can spend a day or two conducting threat models and developing organic detections as a stopgap, it's reasonable to do so, and it's really just a good use case. So what are the steps in performing a threat model? I said I would keep this simple, and I am. These are the basic steps you need. And I'm sure you're looking at them and saying, yes, obviously. But that's my point. This isn't Harry Potter wizardry. I'm not waving a wand and poof, there's a threat model. It's a basic process. If you hear about an organization performing threat modeling, it isn't because they are that much more advanced or they have those elite analysts. They just documented a few of their exercises, defined their process, and they've been able to repeat it. And don't pay attention to the colors of the steps. They don't mean anything. It just looks better than it all be set up. But all of these steps are important. Some are more critical than others. Identifying the threat, developing a hypothesis, and sharing your findings are arguably the most important because they drive the effort. Documentation gets its own arrow because it's key. Otherwise, you're just modeling a threat for the sake of it, and you'll have nothing to show at the end. After you've spent anywhere from 8 to 80 hours of work, you better be able to provide a pretty graph, a flow chart, or at least say we produce detection X as a result and have high confidence we'll detect X activity. Without documentation, you're not going to have that. You'll have to answer a lot of questions to your leadership. But identifying the threat is a relatively simple step, depending on maturity. You should have intelligence collection requirements already established, and ideally broken out into something similar to critical and priority intel requirements to help you focus and guide your collection efforts. Those critical requirements that would force a posture change for your organization, if a threat matches one of those CRs, you should consider a threat model for it. But like I said previously, this is subjective to time and resources. But regardless, that step one is figuring out if the threat matters to you, you can properly assess and test. The second step of identifying affected assets is a difficult one and more appropriately belongs alongside this entire process, kind of like documentation. because it's an ongoing process. Uh, you should define a step for figuring out which assets are affected, obviously, but you'll quickly find as you go through the process and you talk to people that there are a lot of assets you didn't know about and will be newly discovered with each step. But first and foremost, collect what you know. If you get to step 2 and you can't identify any potentially affected assets, you've reached a serious decision point where you need to figure out why you're going down this path. If you have identified this as a threat, but there are no assets that may be affected, is it really a threat? Maybe you need to revisit those requirements at this point. But if it is a threat and there are at least some assets affected, are those assets so critically important that a threat model needs to be performed? This step serves as your sanity check and confirmation whether or not you need to continue on. But it also will play into every step following, because you need to know which assets are affected so that you can build your hypothesis and simulate your attack. But it's also going to play in to analyzing the data and improving detections, because at that point, that's when you need to start to think like a criminal and think how you can exploit those assets and what you can do as follow-on activity so that your threat model can truly run the gamut. The third step of identifying tools for use is a relatively quick one, but not necessary so you can properly design your model and know what is available to you to make sure you have the most comprehensive assessment possible. This isn't an opportunity or an excuse to run to your finance team and say, hey, I need to buy this new fancy tool so I can detect threats, because you're not going to win that argument. You need to assess what is already in place so you know what you can use and where your visibility gaps exist, because it'll inform your hypothesis and your design. Steps 3 and 4 are going to be a back and forth because you have to have a hypothesis and design working in concert with your available tools to make sure you're being realistic and know what information that you'll actually have to work with when you get down to that analyze the data step. You can't design a hypothesis based on how EDR will respond if your organization doesn't have an EDR solution. However, you can come back in your analysis and findings and say, the threat actor would have been stopped with an effective EDR tool. Hint, hint. This can prove as a good opportunity to onboard tools or identify where tools can be improved. Now, the fourth step, build a hypothesis, is critical, because it's not just the hypothesis, it's also the design of your entire effort. And I think this is probably the easiest place to falter, because the obvious answer in this stage is we're going to execute this threat because we expect to be vulnerable to it. That's the really simple one, but it's also not entirely helpful. Your hypothesis and design need to be a little more considerate than that. There should be a fair amount of research and understanding of the threat and your environment that goes into this, because just based on your understanding of the threat and your environment, you should have a decent guess at where you are going to see the attack succeed or fail. And I know when you think hypothesis, you think one sentence statement that encapsulates everything. That's not the case here. This stage is where you explain the threat and where you expect the critical aspects of the attack to occur, how you think your known tools will respond, where you expect visibility gaps to exist, where you expect there to be room for improvement, and any assumptions you are making in this test. Assumptions are really important. Otherwise, you'll have people playing the what if game throughout the process and with your results. Identifying assumptions early, like this threat assumes a previous compromise of an individual user, or this threat assumes Windows event logging is present across the environment, or CTI has identified our organization is of interest to this threat actor. There are a lot of sub-steps. Assumptions need to be laid out. But there are a lot of sub-steps to the hypothesis and design stage. But you have to hit the essentials of what do you expect to happen and what do you expect to result from this activity. Those are essential. What do you expect to happen? and what do you expect to, or how do you expect it to happen, and how do you expect, or what do you expect to result from this activity? And as you're defining these things, it will likely force you back to step 2 and 3 of reassessing your assets and tools and help you be a bit more focused in your efforts. If I could have made this graphic into a nice little cycle with relative ease, so it made graphic sense, I would have, but I'm just not that adept. The fact is, this is a cyclical process to a certain degree, where you'll have to revisit steps, and it's encouraged to be cyclical in nature. Even though I built this linear, it's not a linear process. You will be taking steps back at times. The fun part everybody likes, to simulate the attack. How this is done will vary based on the specific attack and your available resources, but you do need to execute the attack to generate traffic and logs for analysis. You can, of course, like we said before, make the academic guess, but that's unlikely to produce the desired results. Before you simulate an attack, make sure you coordinate with security teams and asset owners so they don't pull the fire alarms, and make sure that you have the authority to do so. Not everybody is entirely comfortable with teams executing attacks against their own network. It might take some convincing. You might have to explain to the powers that be that this is a good thing. It's going to help you improve defense, and somebody will eventually understand. But make sure you have that operating directive, because coordination is huge. Make a call, send an email. Don't surprise anybody with simulated attack traffic. It will not do wonders for your career. And after you've simulated that attack, it's time to analyze the data. I don't know what to say here other than be an analyst. You should have some structured approach to performing log analysis. And ideally, you know what you are looking at. And as part of your design, you're receiving logs for the affected assets. So you have something relevant to analyze. This is one of the really important stages to document. You don't need to record every single thought you have. That's just not feasible, and it's really not helpful. But you should be taking notes during your analysis, and you should be able to aggregate them into a logical narrative that a fellow security analyst can understand. Making sure you have a strong, detailed analysis is important because it's going to help inform other people, but it also may lead to additional opportunity for detections and alerting when a second, third, fourth analyst take a look, because ultimately that's what we're looking for here. We're looking to improve detection, and getting additional viewpoints on it is going to lead to that. And good analysis and documentation always lead to good results. The 7th step of improving detections is intentionally broad, because how it is done will depend on how your organization operates. Do you have an organic capability to develop behavior rules and logic, or do you rely on a third party? Do you have a tool with predefined alerts and rules? Maybe you don't even need to look at rules, and you are just looking for detection improvements, and you're assessing the effectiveness of what is in place. Either way, you should be using your analysis to look for areas of improvement. In your hypothesis and design, you did expect that your EDR tool would identify privilege escalation, or that your DNS logs would detect unusually sized packets. You could be doing something as simple as tuning your proxy to refuse DNS packets over a certain size so that threat actors can't exfil data. Or maybe you're going to go even more in depth and create a behavioral rule to detect DNS packets that are less than 300 bytes or more than 512, and the count is more than 20 in a 5-minute window. The level of complication and your end game is really dependent upon what you want. But this is where you should spend time because your goal is to improve your organization's security posture. And you do that by improving detections. And lastly, share your findings. Don't do this just for yourself. That just doesn't make sense. It's fun, but it's not doing anything for the org. Share your findings internally with your stock because it'll help you educate junior analysts. And you may even generate some thoughts from your team members on how else you can strengthen your security posture. This has happened to my team multiple times. We conduct a threat model and inject a couple detection opportunities. And when we start working with another team to test the effectiveness of the detections, they have suggestions of their own on where else we can implement some improvements. But they were only able to do that because the analysts spent a good amount of time developing a comprehensive narrative and effective explanation of how they achieved the results they did. And don't underestimate good documentation. I know it's the least fun and most bureaucratic aspect of this, but documentation is really important. And this leads me into another aspect of detection improvement step. These improvements do need to be tested and validated, ideally by another team, so there isn't a bias involved. If you created the detection or implemented the improvement, there's already confirmation bias present. You need another party to test the detection, as well as verify that you aren't going to break anything or create a lot of noise. If you have a DevOps team or a security engineering team, they'd be ideal for this. So this is a functional structure that I've laid out. But like I said, the most important here is to document, because you'll be able to go back, take a look, and redefine steps to take when you're ready to create your own process. Because honestly, I don't expect you to take this process back to your organization and say, here's exactly how we do it. But maybe take it back and say, hey, here's a guide on how we do it. Let's adapt it, make it our own. Because you will look at it, you will find other ways to improve it. And that's encouraged. Okay, so I modeled a threat. What now? So I just covered some of this when I was talking about share finding step, but there are 3 primary products that or deliverables that should come out of this. 1, you should have defined some behavioral patterns or indicators of compromise that you or some of your other security teams can work with. 2, you should have identified some security gap, or by some miracle, you confirmed you are the most secure organization ever, and you should get a promotion. More likely your boss gets that promotion, but eventually it trickles down. And 3, you should have a written report where you and your team can reference how you reached your conclusion and why you're so talented. Because after all, the whole point of threat modeling is not for you to do the really fun part of the job and act like a bad guy. It's to make sure the organization is secure. Defining those behavioral patterns is huge because it can be used to build detections, but also they can be used to perform retroactive hunting in the environment or build a threat hunting package for your hunt team. Again, this is completely subject to your organization's makeup. The reasoning for retroactive hunts is because if you're hearing about the threat, it's because some other poor organization was very likely affected by it. So using a little deductive reasoning, we can assume it's been active in the wild for longer than you've known about it. With an understanding of what it looks like as a result from your threat model, we can go looking into logs and see if we saw that activity and maybe remediate an existing problem, or offer some assurance to leadership that you're unaffected and you can expect to be protected because of all of your hard work. But the other benefit of running a threat model, you identify security gaps. This will be important if you identify them because you've discovered blind spots and you've shown that there are some tools that may or may not work. This is one of the less common results of a threat model, but definitely should not be discounted. Your senior leadership will really appreciate it when you point out a tool isn't doing what it should when it comes time for that renewal and seeking out other competition. And lastly, the written report, this one's obvious. I think I beat that one into the ground at this point. Write a report with everything documented, including the steps you took and the action that resulted, not just to show you solved the problem, but for historical context as well. So I just want to run through a case study very quickly. Obviously, this is a 30-minute presentation, so we can't run through an entire threat model, but let's take a couple minutes to run through a recent opportunity for a threat model, the net logon, zero logon vulnerability. It's a critical vulnerability that allows an unauthenticated attacker to compromise domain controllers. And it was extremely trivial to execute and posed a critical threat to virtually any enterprise network. It was disclosed with a patch on Microsoft Patch Tuesday, but we want to figure out what the attack looks like so we can determine how we would be affected and how we could prevent it in case that patch is a little too slow to be applied. And with this specific vulnerability, it requires an attacker to establish a TCP connection to the domain controller, run a command or two, and then they have control of the DC. So there's a new CVE, and let's say you confirmed you have domain controllers. That's really all you need for step one here, identifying the threat. Potential compromise of a DC should absolutely meet your threshold for a critical intel requirement. Since this is a domain controller CVE, we need to identify where they are on the network, how many there are, if they're in the vulnerable version range for the CVE. It's part of identifying affected assets. And since this is a demo, we're going to say that we are confirmed to have vulnerable DCs in the environment. So there's a very simplified version of step two. You would, of course, want to also verify where they are in the network, who has access and to what level, what the security stack looks like, a specific count of DCs, and definitely their versioning. This is only 30 minutes, like I said, so we're not going to run through all of that. But as part of our threat model, we need to determine what tools are available to help us capture the simulated exploitation of the vulnerability on the DCs. We're going to be looking for relevant logs and traffic. While we have a system, say our work computer, we also need packet capture and DC logs and probably endpoint logging to really get that full picture. So let's move forward knowing that we have access to DC logs, endpoint logging, and a handful of others, firewall, Windows event logs. And based on identified assets and tools, what should our hypothesis and design look like? Just think about it for a second, how you would do it. And through the magic of a presentation, we're going to say we wrote a very detailed explanation that states we expect to simulate the attack with the use of a publicly available POC through one of our machines against a VM, because it'd be really bad if we broke the domain controller. We expect with moderate confidence that packet capture will reveal a suspicious TCP connection from an irregular location and provide the necessary data for organic detection. It is also very likely we see this activity in DC logs and potentially Windows event logs. This is also a good opportunity to lay out one clear assumption. Remember I mentioned how important those are? Previous compromise. We are operating under the assumption an attacker already has access to our network, which is not a stretch in an enterprise environment. With our hypothesis in place, we can go ahead and simulate the attack after you coordinate with a SOC and your stakeholders and let them know they may see some odd connections and activity. And when it's done, retrieve your data for analysis. Jump onto that analyze the data step. So let's assume packet capture didn't work. You may have some countries that are more sensitive than others and won't allow you to capture traffic for privacy purposes. So if you can't see what the initial connection looks like, you have to consider where else you might detect the activity. Maybe privilege escalation, admin level commands. So thinking maybe window event logs. You may not have packet analysis, but you can at least recognize the end behavior of the vulnerability is going to be escalating privileges for a non-admin account, in which case you can establish alerting on the domain controller for non-admin accounts executing admin level commands. With analysis of the Windows event logs, you can pull relevant security codes and work with your DevOps team to build detection logic. Maybe a sequence-based execution that will alert your SOC when it occurs on a DC. And since you've been following that critically important step of documenting everything, sharing your findings is a simple part. And improving detections is so natural. cruised right through it, and I'm not sure you even noticed, but improving detections is the easy part. You can provide this threat model to your leadership or your SOC so they know what a potential compromise might look like. You can also create a more detailed version to provide as a threat hunting package to your hunt team. They need to check for similar activity in the environment. They'll also be a good source for potentially testing the activity to make sure your alerts work. And with that, the threat model has run its course, albeit a little simplified. Depending on the complexity, this could have taken significantly longer, and it definitely would have, but this is the most basic way to do it. And this may feel oversimplified, but it really is supposed to be. A threat model is only as hard as you make it. There are plenty of ways of doing this, but you have to strike a balance between what you can do and what you should do, because they aren't always the same. If you overcomplicate it, you'll fall into analysis paralysis and you won't gain ground. Let your complexity grow commensurate with your team's maturity. Don't feel like you need to run the most complicated attack scenario possible for the first attempt. Start small, let the capability grow. Thank you for your time, and I hope you gained something from this.